On a warm Thursday afternoon in early July, the kind of afternoon that fills every beach on the island with sunburned tourists and the runway apron with charter jets from Manchester, Bristol, and Dusseldorf, a routine training sortie over the Ionian Sea turned into one of the most dramatic aviation emergencies Greece has seen in years. A Hellenic Air Force F-16C fighting Falcon, assigned to the 335 Squadron of the 116th Combat Wing based at Araxos Air Base on the Greek mainland, had taken off like it had done hundreds of times before. Nothing about the flight plan suggested anything unusual. It was a training mission, the kind flown almost daily by Greek pilots who patrol and practice over the waters between the mainland and the Ionian Islands, sharpening the skills that keep one of NATO's busiest air forces ready for anything. But somewhere over the sea, everything changed in an instant. The pilot, whose name has not been released, received an in-flight fire warning. For anyone who has never sat in the cockpit of a modern fighter jet, it's hard to convey just how serious that moment is. A fire warning light in an F-16 is not a vague suggestion that something might be wrong. It's built into the aircraft specifically because fire in a machine packed with fuel, hydraulic fluid, and a single high-performance jet engine screaming a few feet behind the pilot's seat is one of the fastest, least forgiving failures an aircraft can suffer. There is no pulling over, there is no coasting to a stop. There is only altitude, airspeed, and decisions that have to be made in seconds, not minutes. According to Greek officials and multiple local media outlets, the pilot made the call almost immediately to divert. The nearest suitable runway was Zakynthos International Airport, known to millions of European holidaymakers simply as Zante, a name synonymous with turquoise water, cliffside villages, and lazy summer package holidays. It is not designed to be an emergency divert field for military fast jets. It is designed to get families from Liverpool and Leeds onto a beach as quickly and painlessly as possible. And yet, on this particular afternoon, it became the stage for a very different kind of arrival. What happened next is where the accounts from officials and the accounts from ordinary people on the ground start to overlap in a way that gives the story its real weight. The Hellenic Air Force has confirmed the broad outline. The pilot executed the diversion, brought the aircraft in, and landed. Officials were careful and precise in their language, describing an emergency landing rather than a crash, and every official statement has stressed the same central fact again and again. The pilot survived, and the pilot was not injured. That is the headline that matters most, and it's worth sitting with for a moment because it would have been very easy for this story to end differently. But if you were standing at the airport that afternoon, or watching from a hotel balcony a few hundred meters from the runway threshold, what you saw and heard was far more chaotic than the calm, clipped language of an official press release. Local media captured a wave of raw, unfiltered reactions from people who had no idea a military emergency was even underway, until it was happening right in front of them. One person described looking out a window and seeing what they called a fireball, the kind of unscripted, visceral reaction you get when someone witnesses something they have absolutely no frame of reference for. Another voice, clearly startled, kept repeating variations of disbelief, the verbal equivalent of a double take, as if their brain needed a few extra seconds to process that a fighter jet, and not some far more mundane piece of airport machinery, had just come down the runway trailing smoke. Someone else described seeing a person running, someone on the ground scrambling to get clear, and for a moment it wasn't clear to any of the onlookers whether that person had even seen what was bearing down on them. This is the layer of the story that rarely makes it into official statements, but that shapes how an event like this actually lives in public memory. Officials talk about airspeed, gear configuration, and fire suppression protocols. Ordinary witnesses talk about fireballs and running figures, and the sheer disbelief of watching a fighter jet do something you only ever expect to see in a film. Both versions are true at the same time, and understanding the incident properly means holding both of them together rather than picking one over the other. What we now know, piecing together statements from Hellenic Air Force officials, aviation specialists, and multiple Greek news organizations, is that the aircraft touched down without its landing gear fully deployed. In technical terms, this is sometimes called a gear-up landing, though in this case reporting suggests the issue may have been tied to the same malfunction that triggered the fire warning in the first place, rather than a separate and unrelated gear failure. When a fast jet like an F-16 comes down without its wheels extended, the underside of the aircraft, its fuselage, its weapons pylons if any are fitted, and its engine intake, makes direct contact with the runway surface. The result is a shower of sparks, a trail of ground friction, and given the fuel load still on board after a training flight, a very real risk of ignition. In this case, that risk became reality. The jet slid along the runway. Friction and heat did what friction and heat do to an airframe full of aviation fuel, and flames broke out around the aircraft as it came to a stop. Here is where the professionalism of everyone involved becomes the actual hero of this story, even if it's a quieter kind of heroism than the dramatic footage suggests. Airport firefighting crews were already on standby, a standard procedure whenever an aircraft declares an emergency and diverts, whether that aircraft is a fighter jet or a passenger airliner, with a warning light in the cockpit. Because those crews were pre-positioned and ready, they were able to respond within moments of the aircraft coming to a stop, rather than scrambling from a standing start. Video captured by witnesses on the ground shows firefighting vehicles converging on the burning aircraft almost immediately, dousing the flames with water and foam. That speed of response is precisely why this story ends with an injury count of 0 rather than something far worse. Just as critical was the pilot's own composure. Reports from Hellenic Air Force officials make clear that the pilot did not eject. Ejecting from a fighter jet is itself a violent, dangerous procedure involving explosive charges that blast the seat and pilot clear of the airframe at speeds that can cause serious injury even when everything goes perfectly. The fact that the pilot chose instead to ride the aircraft down and then exit normally through the canopy once it had come to a stop tells you two things. First, it tells you that despite the fire warning, the aircraft remained controllable enough for a landing to be a viable option, which is itself a testament to how the F-16 is built to survive certain classes of failure. Second, it tells you something about the training and the split-second judgment of a pilot who, under enormous pressure, made a series of correct calls in rapid succession. Divert to the nearest suitable field, manage the approach, get the aircraft down, and get clear of it once it stopped moving. Whoever was in that cockpit that afternoon did their job under about as much stress as a pilot can experience without the situation turning fatal. And they did it well enough that the entire incident, however dramatic it looked from the ground, resolved with everyone walking away. The disruption to civilian life, meanwhile, was immediate and significant, and it says a lot about the particular vulnerability of an island like Zakynthos during peak tourist season. Zakynthos International Airport operates with a single runway. There is no parallel strip to divert traffic to, no secondary approach that controllers can simply switch over to while the primary one is closed. When that one runway is occupied by a burning fighter jet, the entire airport effectively shuts down. A notice to airmen was issued closing the runway to all but approved medical, government, and military helicopter traffic. And that notice landed at the worst possible moment for an airport that, according to Aviation reporting, handles something in the region of 2 million passengers a year, the overwhelming majority of them arriving during the compressed window of the northern European summer. Commercial flights scheduled to land at Zakynthos that afternoon had nowhere to go but away. Aircraft already in the air, loaded with holidaymakers expecting to touch down within the hour, were diverted to Athens, to Corfu, to Thessaloniki, hundreds of kilometers from their intended destination. Picture a family who left their home at 4 a.m. to catch an early flight, who spent the day in transit, dreaming of the moment their plane's wheels touch Greek tarmac and their holiday officially begins, only to be told mid-flight that they are instead landing in Athens, with no immediate onward transport to the island they actually booked. Multiply that single frustrated family by every seat on every diverted aircraft, and you start to get a sense of the ripple effect a few minutes of fire on a runway can have on thousands of ordinary travel plans. Local reporting also noted a wave of outright flight cancellations, not just diversions, as airlines and the airport authority made the judgment that with the runway closed indefinitely while investigators and recovery crews worked, some flights simply could not be salvaged that day. Departure boards reportedly showed a wall of delays stretching deep into the evening. Some flights held for hours past their original departure time. Some passengers who had already been sitting on the tarmac in Athens or elsewhere forced to wait even longer for their aircraft to be cleared to finally proceed. For an airport whose entire economic purpose during these months is to move tourists in and out as smoothly as possible, a single afternoon like this represents a genuine, if temporary, economic wound, not just an inconvenience. There's also a slower, quieter piece of disruption that doesn't show up in a passenger's memory of a ruined travel day but matters enormously to the island's economy. Every hour the runway stays closed is an hour that charter operators, ground handlers, hotel transfer companies, and rental car desks are all operating in chaos rather than their usual well-oiled summer rhythm. Zakynthos, like many Greek islands, has built an entire seasonal economy around the assumption that the airport functions like clockwork for roughly 16 weeks a year. An unplanned closure during that window, even a partial one-day closure, sends shockwaves through hotel check-in schedules, restaurant staffing plans built around expected tourist flow, and the finely tuned logistics of getting rental cars back and forth between the terminal and every resort town on the island. Once the immediate emergency was under control, the story shifted from firefighting to forensics. Specialized Hellenic Air Force recovery teams were dispatched to the island specifically to deal with the aircraft itself, an operation that is far more delicate than simply towing a stranded vehicle off a road. A fighter jet that has just suffered a fire and a gear-up landing is not something you hook up to a truck and drag away. It has to be carefully assessed for structural integrity, checked for any residual fuel or hydraulic hazards, and then moved using specialized equipment designed not to cause further damage to an airframe that investigators will need to examine in detail. Only once that aircraft was fully cleared from the runway could inspectors move in to check the tarmac itself for damage, since a slide of that kind, with a multi-ton aircraft grinding along the surface at speed, has the potential to gouge or otherwise damage the runway surface in ways that would themselves need repair before normal commercial operations could safely resume. The Hellenic Air Force has opened a formal investigation into what triggered the fire warning in the first place, and this is worth unpacking a little because the phrase fire warning covers a fairly wide range of possible underlying causes, and at this early stage, officials have been careful not to speculate publicly on which one applies here. Modern fighter aircraft like the F-16 are fitted with sensors throughout the engine bay and other high-risk zones, systems designed to detect the telltale signs of an overheat or fire condition well before it becomes visible or catastrophic. Those sensors can be triggered by an actual fire, obviously the most serious scenario, but they can also be triggered by other conditions. An overheating component that hasn't yet ignited anything, a hydraulic leak spraying onto a hot surface and producing smoke or vapor that mimics fire signatures, an electrical fault in the detection system itself, producing a false positive, or a mechanical failure elsewhere in the engine that produces heat and debris consistent with what the sensors are built to catch. Investigators will need to examine the wreckage, review flight data recordings, and interview the pilot in detail to reconstruct exactly what happened in those critical seconds between the sensor triggering and the pilot's decision to divert. This is also where the landing gear question becomes important to the investigation, because if reporting is accurate that the jet came down without its gear extended, investigators will need to determine whether that was a direct consequence of whatever triggered the fire warning, for instance, a hydraulic or electrical failure that also knocked out the gear extension system, or whether it was an entirely separate mechanical issue that simply happened to compound an already serious situation. Aircraft accident investigations live and die on exactly this kind of distinction. A single malfunction that cascades into multiple visible symptoms tells a very different story and points to a very different fix than two unrelated failures occurring within the same flight by coincidence. It's worth stepping back here and placing this incident within the broader context of fighter jet operations generally, because incidents like this, however rare and however dramatic when they do occur, are part of the reality of operating high-performance military aircraft. The F-16 is one of the most widely used fighter platforms in the world, flown by dozens of air forces across multiple continents, with a combined fleet history stretching back decades and comprising many millions of flight hours. Across that enormous base of operational experience, technical malfunctions, including fire warnings, hydraulic failures, and gear malfunctions, do occur from time to time, simply because any sufficiently complex machine operating at the edge of its performance envelope will occasionally suffer component failures. What separates a story like this one from a genuine catastrophe is almost always the combination of two things: robust aircraft design that gives pilots options even when something goes wrong, and rigorous pilot training that ensures those options are used correctly and quickly under pressure. Greece's Air Force operates more than 100 F-16s across multiple variants, making it one of the largest operators of the type outside the United States. And those aircraft form the backbone of the country's air defense posture in a part of the world where tensions in the air, particularly over the Aegean, have made a capable and well-trained Air Force a matter of persistent national priority. Training flights like the one that ran into trouble this week are not occasional exercises. They are the daily, unglamorous, essential work that keeps that capability sharp. Pilots fly these missions constantly over open water where mistakes are less costly and airspace is less congested, precisely so that the rare moment when something genuinely goes wrong finds them ready rather than caught flat-footed. There's also a broader safety systems lesson buried in this story that's easy to miss amid the drama of burning wreckage and panicked witnesses. Every layer of the response that worked well here, from the pilot's decision-making to the prepositioned fire crews to the rapid issuance of a runway closure notice to protect other air traffic, exists because of lessons learned from previous incidents, some of them far less fortunate than this one. Aviation safety, whether military or civilian, is built almost entirely out of hard-won lessons from past failures. The protocol that has fire crews standing by whenever an aircraft declares an emergency exists because, at some point in aviation history, an aircraft that needed that response didn't have it in time. The training that teaches pilots to divert immediately to the nearest suitable field rather than trying to nurse a damaged aircraft home exists, because pilots who made the opposite choice sometimes didn't survive to explain why. None of this makes the fear and chaos captured by ordinary witnesses on the ground any less real or any less understandable. It simply means that fear and chaos played out against a backdrop of systems specifically engineered to contain it. And in this case, those systems worked exactly as intended. It's also worth acknowledging just how disorienting an event like this is for the people who happen to be nearby when it unfolds, because their experience is arguably the most human part of this entire story. Tourists and airport staff on Zakynthos that afternoon were not expecting a military emergency. They were expecting flight delays, sunburn, and the usual mild chaos of a busy holiday airport. Instead, they found themselves witnessing, in real time and without warning, a fighter jet trailing smoke down a runway, then erupting into visible flame just meters from where ordinary civilian life was going about its business. The confusion captured in witness accounts, the disbelief, the scramble to understand what was happening, the instinctive fear when someone was seen running near the aircraft, all of that is a completely natural human response to an utterly abnormal event intruding into an ordinary day. It's a reminder that behind every aviation incident, however well it resolves from a technical and operational standpoint, there is a group of ordinary people whose day was upended and whose nerves took a real hit, even if their physical safety was never actually in question. As the investigation moves forward, expect the focus to shift gradually away from the dramatic footage that dominated the first day of coverage and toward the more technical, less visually striking questions that actually determine what changes, if any, come out of this incident. Was this a one-off component failure specific to this particular airframe, or does it point to a broader issue that could affect other aircraft in the Hellenic Air Force's F-16 fleet, prompting a wider inspection program? Did the emergency response procedures, from the pilot's initial decision to divert through to the ground crew's firefighting response, perform exactly as designed? Or are there lessons to be incorporated into future training and protocols? And what, if anything, does this incident suggest about the readiness of civilian airports like Zakynthos to absorb a military emergency landing during the busiest weeks of their commercial calendar, given how quickly a single runway closure can cascade into disrupted travel plans for thousands of people across an entire region? For now, the essential facts remain both simple and, in their own way, reassuring. A pilot flying a routine training mission experienced a serious in-flight emergency, made a series of correct and fast decisions under intense pressure, and brought a burning aircraft safely to the ground without injury to himself or to anyone on the ground. Airport firefighting crews responded with the speed and professionalism their training demands. Civilian air traffic was disrupted, inconvenienced, and in some cases outright canceled, but no one was hurt in the incident itself. And now, as a standard practice after any aviation emergency, investigators will spend the coming weeks and months carefully reconstructing exactly what went wrong, so that whatever lesson this incident holds can be folded back into the systems, training, and maintenance practices that are supposed to make sure the next fire warning, whenever and wherever it happens, ends exactly the same way this one did, with everyone walking away. It is also worth noting how quickly a story like this travels once it starts, and how the different threads of coverage, official statements from Hellenic Air Force spokespeople, footage shared by bystanders on social media, and reporting from Greek and international outlets each captured a different facet of the same 15 or 20 minutes of real time. The official channel gave the world the calm, procedural version. Aircraft type, squadron, base of origin, nature of the malfunction, confirmation the pilot was safe. The bystander footage gave the world the raw, unfiltered version. Smoke, flame, disbelief, the sound of sirens converging. And the aviation press gave the world the technical version. NOTAM timings, runway designations, passenger volume statistics, and diversion routes. Put together, these three threads form a far more complete picture than any single one could on its own. And it's a useful reminder of just how much modern breaking news depends on exactly that kind of layered, overlapping coverage, official, eyewitness, and expert, arriving almost simultaneously and needing to be woven together into a single coherent account. It's worth spending a little more time on the economics of a single closed runway, because it's easy to underestimate just how much weight sits on that one strip of asphalt during a Greek summer. Zakynthos is not a city with multiple transport options feeding into it. It is an island, and for the vast majority of its visitors, the airport is the only practical way in or out. A ferry exists, but it is not built to absorb the volume of a canceled day of flights, and it certainly cannot absorb it on short notice. So when that single runway closes, even for a matter of hours, there is no meaningful alternative route for thousands of people to reach the island or leave it. Hotels that had rooms turning over that evening, expecting one set of guests to check out in the morning and a fresh set to check in by early afternoon, suddenly have guests stranded in Athens with nowhere to sleep and rooms sitting empty that were supposed to be occupied. Car rental companies that had vehicles scheduled to be picked up by early evening find themselves with a fleet sitting idle, while the return of yesterday's cars, delayed by the same disruption, has not yet happened either. None of this is dramatic in the way that footage of a burning fighter jet is dramatic, but in aggregate, it represents a meaningful, if temporary, dent in the local economy during the handful of weeks each year when that economy does the bulk of its annual business. There's also a broader pattern worth naming. which is that Zakynthos, like several other Greek islands with only a single runway, exists in a kind of permanent trade-off between geography and resilience. Building a second runway, or the infrastructure, to redirect large volumes of civilian traffic on short notice would cost far more than the airport's seasonal traffic could ever justify. The result is an airport that runs beautifully almost every single day of the year, and then, on the rare day when something genuinely unusual happens, has essentially no slack to absorb it. That is not a criticism of how the airport is run. It is simply the reality of small island aviation infrastructure everywhere in the world. And it's part of why an emergency landing like this one, however well it was handled in the moment, still produces days of ripple effects across the wider travel and tourism ecosystem of the island. Turning back to the technical side of the story, it is worth explaining a little more about what actually happens inside a modern fighter jet's fire detection system, because that context helps make sense of why officials have been so careful not to jump to conclusions about the cause. Aircraft like the F-16 are fitted with what are generally called fire and overheat detection loops, continuous sensor lines that run through the engine bay and other critical areas of the airframe. These loops are engineered to respond to rapid increases in temperature consistent with fire or overheat conditions. And when they detect that signature, they trigger a warning in the cockpit almost instantly. The entire point of the system is to give the pilot the earliest possible notice. Because in an aircraft where fuel lines, hydraulic lines, and a jet engine all sit within a tightly packed fuselage, the difference between an early warning and a late one can be the difference between a controlled diversion and a catastrophic loss of the aircraft. But precisely because these systems are built to be extremely sensitive, they can occasionally be triggered by conditions that mimic a fire without an actual flame being present. A hydraulic line that has begun to leak onto a hot engine component can produce smoke and a heat signature that trips the same sensors as an actual fire. An electrical fault within the detection system's own wiring can, in rare cases, produce a false signal even when nothing is actually wrong in the engine bay. A bleed air duct, which carries extremely hot compressed air drawn from the engine for uses like cabin pressurization and anti-icing, can develop a leak that raises local temperatures enough to trigger a warning, again without necessarily meaning an uncontained fire has broken out. This is precisely why investigators do not simply take a fire warning at face value as proof that flames were present in flight, and why the formal investigation opened by the Hellenic Air Force matters so much. It will systematically rule these possibilities in or out using flight data, physical inspection of the recovered airframe, and detailed pilot debriefing, rather than relying on the assumption that the cockpit warning alone tells the whole story. The landing gear question sits alongside this in a similarly careful, methodical way. Some Greek media reports describe the jet touching down without its wheels deployed, sliding along the runway before catching fire, which would be broadly consistent with what witnesses on the ground described as a fireball at the moment of impact, since a metal airframe grinding along concrete at high speed generates exactly the kind of sparks and friction that can ignite residual fuel almost instantly. If that sequence holds up under investigation, the next question becomes whether the same failure that triggered the fire warning also disabled the gear extension system, for instance, through a shared hydraulic or electrical pathway, or whether the pilot made a deliberate decision not to lower the gear at all, a choice that experienced fast jet pilots are trained to consider in certain fire scenarios, specifically because a gear-up landing, while it guarantees damage to the underside of the aircraft, can sometimes reduce other risks compared to a normal gear-down landing when a fire is already suspected on board. Investigators will look closely at exactly this kind of decision tree because it speaks directly to whether procedures worked as designed or whether refinements are needed. There's a broader analytical point here about how modern accident investigations differ enormously from how the public tends to consume this kind of story in the first 24 hours. The public experience of an incident like this is dominated by the most visually striking and emotionally immediate elements: a bystander's video of flames and smoke, a witness's shaky voice recounting a fireball, a headline built around the word crash. Investigators, by contrast, spend the following weeks and often months working almost entirely with unglamorous material: recorded flight parameters showing engine temperatures and control inputs second by second, maintenance logs stretching back through the aircraft's recent service history, radio transcripts of exactly what the pilot reported to air traffic control, and in what order, and physical inspection of components that, to an untrained eye, look like nothing more than scorched metal. The gap between those two experiences, the emotionally vivid public story and the methodical technical investigation running quietly underneath it, is one of the most consistent features of how aviation incidents unfold everywhere in the world, and this one is no exception. It's also worth placing this event, briefly, in the context of Greece's wider defense posture, because training flights of exactly this kind are not incidental. The Hellenic Air Force maintains one of the most active flying programs in Europe relative to its size, driven in large part by the country's geography, a long coastline, dozens of inhabited islands, and an airspace environment along its eastern border that has, for decades, required constant readiness. Training missions over the Ionian Sea, on the western side of the country, are generally considered lower tension airspace compared to the Aegean, which is precisely why routine training sorties are flown there, but they still demand the same standard of aircraft readiness and pilot proficiency as any other mission, because equipment failures do not check the geopolitical map before they occur. This particular sortie, launched from Araxos Air Base, home to squadrons that have flown the F-16 for decades, was in every sense an ordinary Tuesday of military life, until it very suddenly wasn't. Finally, it's worth returning one more time to the human center of this story, because it is easy, in an analysis like this, to let the technical and economic dimensions crowd out the simplest and most important fact of all. A person got into a fighter jet that afternoon expecting a routine flight, was confronted with a warning that every pilot trains for but few ever actually experience, made the right calls under enormous pressure in the space of a few minutes, and walked away from an aircraft that was, by the time it stopped moving, on fire. That is the story underneath every other layer of this event: the diversions, the delays, the investigation, the economic ripple effects on a tourist island in peak season. All of it flows from one person's composure at the controls of a burning aircraft, and all of it ends, fortunately, with that person safe on the ground. In the end, this is a story about a bad afternoon that could have been so much worse than it was, and about the quiet, unglamorous systems and split-second decisions that made sure it wasn't. A fire warning at altitude over open water, a pilot who chose the nearest runway and got the aircraft down, a ground crew that was ready before the wheels, or in this case the belly of the aircraft, ever touched the tarmac, a community of witnesses who understandably feared they were watching something far worse unfold in front of them, and an investigation now underway that will spend far longer and attract far less attention than the dramatic few minutes that made this a headline in the first place, quietly working out exactly what went wrong so that it doesn't happen again the same way twice.